We'll go ahead and get started. Okay. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, The Legacy Dilemma, Navigating Security, Responsibility, and Regulation for Connected Medical Devices. My name is Jeff Mann. I'm the Senior Physical Threat Analyst with the Health ISAC, and I will be introducing today's speakers from MedCrypt. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. However, the speakers may wait to address them at the end. Today's webinar will be recorded and sent to registrants, as well as be available on the MedCrypt website. Today we'll be hearing from Axel Wirth from MedCrypt and Christian Rosenzweig from the Johner Institute. As Chief Security Strategist, Axel Wirth provides strategic vision and industry leadership to MedCrypt and its customers. In this role, he helps guide the company in critical security strategy decisions and supports the adoption of leading security technologies by the healthcare industry. He's an advocate for compliance, privacy, and security, and ultimately patient safety in healthcare. Wirth draws from over 30 years of international experience in the industry. Christian worked for more than 10 years in software development for medical devices. There, as a project manager and software developer, he was responsible for the support and operational implementation of tasks in the product lifecycle, for creation of documentation and training materials for end users, and for the implementation and support of conformity assessment procedures in the EU. Dealing with regulatory requirements on a daily basis ultimately led him to quality management at a large corporation, where he was able to gain international experience as a quality management officer under ISO 13485. He has been supporting the consulting team at the Johner Institute since 2019. Legacy medical devices, often the backbone of care, now present one of the biggest cybersecurity, operational, and regulatory challenges for healthcare. They are facing an increasingly sophisticated onslaught of threats, and with hospitals becoming more reliant on third-party services, AI-powered tools, and cloud-hosted platforms, the lines of responsibility between manufacturers and providers are blurring. This webinar will unpack the layered legacy burden from both the manufacturer and hospital perspectives. We'll explore what legacy really means in an era where connected services, AI, and post-quantum cryptography are redefining survivability, security, and compliance expectations. From secured DICOM and HIS-LIS challenges to the stark reality of HIPAA breaches, we'll walk through real-world cases that highlight how regulatory gaps and aging infrastructure can compound risk, and how to think differently about managing these evolving obligations. And with that, I'll pass it over to our speakers.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, everybody, for joining today. And thank you, Christian, for, again, hosting a webinar together. Appreciate always your insight and your expertise. So as Jeff was saying, the topic here today is going to be around legacy devices. And we do have a fairly packed agenda, so I'm going to dive in pretty quickly. And of course, the joke on the side here is, if it works, don't touch it. But is that still true in today's world of software-based medical devices exposed to cybersecurity threats? And that's what we're going to be talking through in the presentation today. To clarify what we're going to focus on, if you use the term legacy, you can actually use it in different ways, applying to the entire device, the hardware of the device included, or just the software of the device, looking at legacy from a functional perspective of the software, or looking at legacy from a cybersecurity perspective. Right? And those are three distinctly different views and very similar. A regulator or a standards organization or a manufacturer or an operator will also have differing views of what legacy means for them. And our focus will be mainly on that lower right corner here of that diagram. And I wanted to make sure that everybody understands how we are setting the context here of legacy, but also understand that the term legacy may be used very differently by different people, again, depending on their perspective and context. And if you wonder what the picture on the left is, that is actually the very first MRI scanner that was capable of scanning a human-sized subject. So certainly a legacy device, if there is one. With that, I'll hand over to Christian for the first section on regulatory appraisal.
No, wasn't that your topic, Axel?
Okay, sorry. Should have taken notes. Um, so in general, the same is true that cybersecurity is a shared responsibility between manufacturers and the healthcare delivery organization. And I think if it is around end of life, end of support management, and legacy status of devices, this is truer than ever, right? This is where the manufacturer and the operator of the device need to work closely together, need to communicate, need to make sure they're both on the same page. What are the challenges? Basically, cybersecurity creates a misalignment between the life cycle of the physical device, a device that maybe 10, 15, 20 years old, is still performing its clinical purpose, but the software may be outdated, may no longer be maintained and patched, which then leads to an increasing cybersecurity risk of that particular device. There are also financial challenges. Hospitals cannot afford to purchase new devices that still perform their clinical function. And cybersecurity reasons alone may not be enough of a motivator to make a $500,000 or $1 million investment into new types of devices. So this would create a truly complex patchwork of devices and IT systems with very different security postures and with very unique and different security gaps that need to be managed by the hospitals. The challenges and the efforts we need to put forward today is that regulation standards and engineering practices are starting to address the legacy challenge, but it's only going forward for new devices being introduced in the market, right? Better choices about the software components, better architecture and design choices, easier to maintain and update, and so forth. But again, that doesn't help us with devices that are currently in operation. Certainly, the hospital can reduce, but not totally eliminate the cyber risk that comes from legacy devices. You can, as a hospital, segment your network. You can put firewalls in front of those network segments, or in some cases, even directly in front of specific devices if the cost warrants it. You can work with various access control schemes, whether that is local access or remote access and so forth. So yes, there are things you can do, but they will always be secondary. So with any device that is out there, and we'll talk about that in more detail later, ultimately the risk will be transferred to the operator. At some point in the future, the manufacturer will declare device end of support, and then you as the operator need to take over the responsibility, or you as the operator replace the device. So that's a problem that is not going away, but proper communication, information sharing, timely heads up help to reduce the pain of the problem. Looking at regulators, specifically the FDA here in the US, as per the June 2025 pre-market cybersecurity guidance, a couple of important points that come out of that guidance. First of all, FDA defines a cyber device very broadly. Right? Anything that has the ability to connect is considered a cyber device. Even if it is not intended to be connected, the assumption is if it has a port, somebody will at some point plug something into the port that may expose the device to cybersecurity risks. But there's also an interesting conflict, and that is that any software-based device will need to be updated from time to time. Well, that update requires connectivity. An Ethernet port, maybe a temporary connection, a USB thumb drive, maybe temporarily inserted, but nevertheless, that still falls under the umbrella of the ability to connect. Also, FDA in the pre-market guidance emphasizes strongly the need for end-of-life and end-of-support planning and communication. So the earlier the operator, the hospital, knows about upcoming end-of-support dates, the better they can prepare for it. The June 2025 guidance made some significant changes relative to the previous guidance. And I think the most overarching important change is that it aligned FDA guidance with Section 524B of the FD&C Act, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. FD&C Act is a law, which means that the FDA cybersecurity guidance is now aligned with the legal requirement for cybersecurity. So it is no longer aligned with the general assumption that cybersecurity is only relevant to the FDA if it is related to patient safety. The FD&C Act made cybersecurity a standalone responsibility of the FDA, and the FDA updated the guidance accordingly. Also, one interesting part in the guidance, and please look at the guidance for details here. But what if you have an existing device that was approved under previous FDA cybersecurity guidance, and you now submit for a change? Then you need to provide a post-market management plan and indicate how you will manage the device going forward, and you need to document through procedures and documentation that the device provides reasonable assurance for cybersecurity, and also include a description of present vulnerabilities that could cause uncontrolled risk. Also, FDA emphasizes from a documentation perspective software bill of materials, where it talks about including the NTIA minimum elements requirements that are spelled out in the document linked here. But in addition, FDA is asking for information on the software components, level of support, and end of support date. So that again ties back to the importance of communication about a device's upcoming end of support and legacy status. Looking at another market, looking at the EU under MDR and IVDR, legacy in this presentation here we're discussing today is from a cybersecurity perspective. Be aware that the term legacy over in Europe is also used for devices that were previously approved under the old Medical Device Directive and now need to be brought up to the level of MDR, independent of whether they're software or non-software devices. Right? That is not what we're talking about here. We're using the term legacy merely from a cybersecurity perspective. So the key principles are that there is no general grandfathering by the MDR regulators. So there's no automatic exemption for legacy devices from a cybersecurity perspective, and cybersecurity obligations still need to be met as spelled out in Annex 1 of MDR. Continuous risk management, but you need to maintain your post-market surveillance processes and continuously monitor for cybersecurity vulnerabilities and risks. You need to address and implement state-of-the-art security, implement security measures based on latest best practices, need to execute corrective actions, meaning timely release of software updates and communication of cybersecurity risks. You need to document and report everything related to cyber security. And then for any serious security incident with safety impact, manufacturers must now follow vigilance reporting procedures. And Christian will get into that later in more detail. Another document that is, I think, highly relevant to our discussion is a document published back in 2023 by the International Medical Device Regulators Forum that sets forth the most commonly used definition of a legacy device, which is a device that cannot be reasonably protected against current cybersecurity threats. So that is a little broader than just talking about software no longer being supported, right? There are different aspects that need to be considered here. And again, I think that definition, at least if you look at it from a cybersecurity and healthcare provider perspective, is a very solid definition of the term legacy device. And with that, this time correctly, I'm handing off to Christian.
Yeah, thank you, Axel. So we are talking about the standards, and in Europe, standards have more impact or more relevance as they might be harmonized, which means they fulfill the medical device regulation, or by fulfilling those standards, you demonstrate that you are in compliance to the law. So it's worth to look into those standards. And I picked out some standards that deal with the term legacy somehow. So for example, IEC 62304, the software lifecycle standard, says medical device, which was not developed under this standard, under the 62304, but which is still brought to the market, is called legacy software. So it's a complete different definition of legacy software or legacy device compared to the IMDRF definition that we saw in the previous slide, which says medical device that cannot be reasonably protected against current cybersecurity threats is called legacy device. And the most relevant standard for IT security is the security lifecycle management standard, the 81001-5-1, which will get harmonized in the European Union. And it does not use the term legacy software, it uses the term transitional health software. The definition is very similar to the 62304 because it says it means health software which was released prior to publication of this document and which does not meet all requirements specified within that standard. So that means any device that was not developed under the 81001-5-1 is considered transitional health software. And for this transitional health software, we must know how to deal with that. And this is exactly what is covered by the standard. Next slide, please. So if we look at the approach of 62304 regarding legacy software, it's a really, I would say, practical approach, which means when you are not sure whether the software of a legacy device, which was not developed under a structured development process, if you know nothing about the bugs or problems or issues that are in that software, then you can make use of the post-market data. And if you can demonstrate that there are no significant software problems, then you have half of the tasks. And the other half is you have to perform a software risk analysis that demonstrates also that there are no significant residual risks within that software. And then you can say, with this demonstration that there are no issues demonstrated by post-market data and no issues coming from the risk analysis, so we can assume the software is as safe and efficient as possible and we can keep it in the market as it is, if we do not change anything at the software, so if we do not do a design change. And the question is, can we transfer this concept also to cybersecurity? And the clear answer is no, this approach is not possible for cybersecurity. Why? Because we do not know all vulnerabilities. So it could happen that the vulnerability is identified in the future, not yet. So it's not clear whether the device is really free of vulnerabilities or not. That's one thing. The other thing is there might be risk control measures that are not sufficient anymore in a couple of months or years. For example, the post-quantum cryptography issue that Axel will explain later is something that will come or will arise in the future when certain or specific conditions are met. And this is something you don't know at the current time of being. So this approach of saying my device was secure in the past, so I assume it will be secure in the future, is not correct. And the question is, what are we supposed to do? Next slide, please. So now we come to the description of 81001-5-1, and it says basically the compliance to that standard is demonstrated by clause 4 to 9. And for transitional health software, you have to stick to Annex F. And Annex F is not an informative annex, it's a normative annex. So it's mandatory to be fulfilled, at least if the standard is harmonized. So let's go to the next slide. What does Annex F ask for? it says there are two options. One option is to redevelop the health software from the scratch. So this is something that most manufacturers don't want to do, because if they have a big portfolio of legacy devices in the market, they do not want to reinvent everything. So the second option seems to be better. And the second option says improve the security of the health software by activities such as updating the security operating guidelines, mandating compensating controls, or partially rewriting the health software. So partially rewriting sounds a little bit better than completely re-engineering the device. So let's look into F2 to F4. What does it require? And the first requirement is we have to implement activities of clause 4. That means quality management. We have to implement the security lifecycle process and the security risk management process into the quality management system. Well, that is done anyway, because for future projects, for future product developments, we must have this in place in the quality management system. Next step is a gap analysis for the deliverables. So for our documentation, we have to ensure that a full comprehensive requirement specification is available according to the state of the art. We have to perform security tests, including penetration tests, and we have to do a security risk analysis, a full comprehensive risk analysis based on threat modeling with the corresponding risk controls. And based on the outcome of those activities, we can close gaps, for example, by compensating controls or by documentation that is created, for example, the security labeling that is handed over to the operator. So this ensures that the most obvious gaps are closed. And after doing that with number 4, it comes to the evaluation whether the transitional health software can remain on the market based on the overall residual risks. So we need a justification or rationale why we believe that the device can now be kept on the market as it is. And anyway, we need also to create a plan to implement post-market activities. So for example, vulnerability scanning, vulnerability monitoring, and vulnerability management must be in place as a process based on the SBOM, for example. So you see that a lot of activities are necessary, not the full extent of cybersecurity requirements, but I would say a good portion of that. And many manufacturers do not talk about that at the moment. So they are waiting until there comes pressure by the notified bodies. And the notified bodies are starting with that pressure currently. They are asking, for example, for penetration tests for the legacy devices, for the devices that are currently in the market, not developed under security guidelines. So that means you have to find a strategy to perform those activities that are mentioned on that slide, at least start with penetration tests. And something that Axel and me observed in the market was the following thing. Some notified bodies already started to ask for penetration tests or to do penetration tests within unannounced audits. So that can happen that a notified body takes out any kind of product that you have in your portfolio and performs a penetration test on your costs to demonstrate whether this device is secure or not. And this is something you have to keep in mind. And my strong recommendation is create a project plan for those legacy devices in the market that clearly assigns responsibilities, that clearly says what activities are performed by which people and when, at which times. Next slide, please. Yeah.
Yeah. So obviously there are, as we said initially, very different ways how we can look at legacy. As Christian was just explaining on the examples of 81001 and 60304, a regulator or a standards organization may look at a device and calling it legacy if it was developed and market introduced before a certain standard or a certain regulation was in place. A manufacturer may have a different view. They may say, we call it a legacy device, any device that we developed before we had formal development processes in place and followed those formal security lifecycle processes. Or a variation thereof is a device that was market approved before security compliance was required by the regional regulators. But a manufacturer may also look at the availability and the support of third-party software components. So you may have built a device on a particular commercial operating system that has become end of life, and that may become for you the trigger to declare end of support on the device. And then for the healthcare delivery organization, it is typically a device that is no longer supported by the manufacturer. And yes, there are different scenarios, but I think the main scenario is simple, that the manufacturer is no longer supporting the device or the device's software if you think about cybersecurity. And this is what IMDRF used as the baseline of their definition for legacy. There's another important, I think, white paper out there that was published by the Health Sector Coordinating Council last year that in great length and in about 100 pages dives into the topic of legacy, including the definition of the various stages of a device's life after market introduction. You go through your typical production and sales process, you end of life the device, and then you still offer support, but at some point you may end offer guaranteed support, and may only offer support in the exceptional situation. But yet at another point in time in the future, you have a total end of support when you won't or can't longer support the device. What is important that along those lines, and that starts at the very beginning, the manufacturer communicates with the healthcare organization about upcoming end of life and end of support dates. And those dates may change during the life of the device, so any changes should be communicated as well. And then once guaranteed support approaches its end, you should then think about risk and license transfer. And then similar, that has the impact on support contracts you may have with your customers, and it may have impact on training as part of the risk transfer. From the hospital or operator perspective, I think the term end of life is sometimes also used when a device is decommissioned, is taken out of operation. I think end of use is probably a better term. And I think the biggest difference being that end of life and end of support applies to an entire product line or version of a product, whereas end of use is a individual physical device. You basically discard an infusion pump because it dropped on the floor once too many times, but you keep using the other 900 pumps because they're still perfectly fine. So again, the perspective of end of something is different for the manufacturer as it is for the operator. But it is still important to understand that at some point the operator will take over the responsibility for maintaining the device or ends using the device, but replaces it for a newer version. And then another important statement about risk transfer that also is highlighted in the FDA guidance, and that is that risk should only be transferred if it is transferable. Meaning, catch, you got it now is not proper risk transfer. There should be documentation, there should be training, there should be guidance for your customers, and the device should be technically capable of being secured, even though it cannot be patched any longer. A couple of other highlights on this topic. So as I said earlier, for the MDM, the medical device manufacturer, end of life is end of production and sale. End of support is when the contractual support obligation ends. and end of support then pushes a device to legacy status unless there is a replacement or upgrade path. But these steps are not always clear-cut. But a device may still be supported. You can still buy spare parts and call a technician to install those spare parts, but the software may no longer be supported, right? So your cyber end of support may be different than your device end of support. That's, again, a gray zone that exists. From the healthcare provider perspective, as I said earlier, it is better to call it end of use than end of life to avoid confusion with the manufacturer terminology. And the scenarios that can push a device for end of use can be technical, but the thing is broken and can no longer be repaired. A lease may come to an end. You may resell it to somebody else. You may donate it. You may upgrade to new clinical services that require a new version of that device, and so forth. And also important, consider uncontrolled end of use, right? What happens if a device gets stolen, gets lost, or gets decommissioned, not following procedure? That is a variation of the end of use scenario that needs to be also considered. What is the impact of end of life for the manufacturer? Communication, shared responsibilities, activities that should be covered as part of the purchasing and maintenance contracts, right? It should be spelled out how the manufacturer and the hospital engage once that end of life and end of support is reached. The manufacturer should also prepare for future legacy, meaning that any future devices being designed today should be better prepared for operation and being secure once they enter the legacy phase, but also unexpected legacy. What happens if one of your suppliers goes bankrupt and can no longer support the software or the hardware component with a firmware on it that you have been using, and so forth? So there is unexpected or unplanned legacy. Cybersecurity related activities, timely communication, update of communication along the life of the device, formal risk transfer, formal license transfer, right? The device may run commercial software components, operating system, antivirus, you name it, that may be licensed then by the operator, and then training as needed. And then for the healthcare delivery organization, as a result of the manufacturer's end of support, you need to ask yourself the questions: can the device be reasonably secured? And the answer in some cases may be yes. Network segmentation, take the device off the network, controlling the environment, firewalling, other things. You can probably not totally eliminate risk, but you can certainly reduce risk. Not possible in all cases, but worth looking at. Is then the resulting risk acceptable, and is the path forward economic? Is the cost of keeping the device alive higher than the profit the device generates for you as a hospital? Does your organization understand the residual risk, and especially your business leadership, right? Do they understand what the risk is of still running a Windows XP MRI scanner? And then obviously, does the device's lifecycle status and upcoming end of support inform your replacement planning? Is your replacement planning mature enough to also consider cybersecurity as part of your future purchases? Decommissioning is a different activity that is more a technical activity. The destruction of data on the device, whether it is PHI or PII, other clinical data, clinical trial data, for example, but also user and network credentials. Right? There are plenty of reports from security researchers that bought a particular device on eBay to do their security research, and the first thing they discovered is that the device still had the hospital's Wi-Fi credentials stored on it. So it's not just patient data, intellectual property as well. The device may contain data that should be transferred before destruction of the data. It needs to be archived or stored somewhere potentially, or the scenario the other way around, the device may push data into storage, whether it is physical or cloud-based. And what happens if the device gets decommissioned? Does it mean that the stored data that is related to the device but not on the device needs to be retrieved, needs to be destroyed, needs to be transferred to another device, and so forth? So plenty of questions around that decommissioning stage. And with that, I'll pass back to Christian.
Yeah, thank you. So we talked a lot about the definition of the term legacy device. We looked at the end of life and the status of the devices. And now we get closer to the risks, to the practical risks. So the first thing is there's often a communication gap between the manufacturers and the operators. So for example, it is not clearly transferred when the responsibility goes over from the manufacturer to the operator. So end of support dates are not sufficiently enough communicated. And we know that a lot of operators still use medical devices. So here is a figure of 73% of healthcare facilities still use medical devices with legacy systems. So you see that might be the biggest problem with legacy, that there are so many legacy devices in the market where probably nobody knows exactly who is responsible, because the operators think the manufacturers are still responsible, but the manufacturers already stopped their activities. On the other side, there are information asymmetries. So for example, the operators have limited insights into the security architecture of the device. So no medical device manufacturer clearly describes how the internal design of the medical device looks like, because they consider that as an intellectual property, but it is necessary to be known by the operators for their efforts regarding cybersecurity. So at least a threat model diagram, a data flow diagram of the architecture should be handed over. But also the manufacturers do not have sufficient knowledge of the operator's network environment or the use environment of the device. So this is not considered during the development sufficiently. And a very specific means of communication between manufacturer and operator is the software bill of materials, which should be provided by the medical device manufacturer, but in many cases it is not provided. And so the operator cannot use that for its own risk management or vulnerability scanning. And here's another figure as an example. In Europe, 25% of CT scanners are inadequate from a cybersecurity perspective, but are still in operation for cost reasons. So that's demonstrating how big this problem with legacy devices still is. Next slide, please. Yeah, legacy devices, what's the impact? The impact can be that the legacy device contains attack surface increases continuously. And even if you implement compensating controls, that does not mean that the vulnerabilities disappear. They are still present. So for example, if you disconnect the device and you have still a vulnerability in your system, it could happen that a physical access attack can make use of that vulnerability. So the vulnerability is still present, and compensating controls are not fully covering security. There are several attack methods that are very interesting. So for example, a targeted attack, that means that an adversary intends to attack a specific organization. He identifies a legacy device as a viable entry point and tries to find out known vulnerabilities of that specific device. And by knowing them, he can make his attacks specifically to that vulnerability in that specific device. That is a targeted attack. The other type of attacks that happen are coincidental compromises, like we saw with the WannaCry ransomware attack a few years ago. So adversaries create exploits or malwares that search themselves in the network for target devices that can be compromised by knowing a specific vulnerability type, and they just search which device or which product shows that typical vulnerability, and then they can attack that device. And this is an exposure that scales with popularity of a given software. And we saw that with WannaCry. Next slide, please. WannaCry was an malware that was created specifically for a vulnerability in the Windows operating system. And as you know, Windows operating systems are widely spread. And so this WannaCry outbreak was really tremendous and was spread around the world, and even healthcare facilities were affected. Here you see the figures of 81 of 236 hospitals in UK were affected, and also general practitioners. 20,000 cancellations of medical interventions happened. 70,000 devices and systems, including MRI and infusion pumps, were affected. So this is demonstrating the dramatic situation that can happen out of legacy devices, because so many legacy devices are out there, and it's only a matter of time or a question of time when the next big outbreak will happen like this. Yeah, next slide, please. So coming to the best practices, what can we do to prevent the situation with legacy devices? So this is more or less a proactive approach that can be taken by the medical device manufacturers. So first of all, they have to implement security by design. So from the very beginning, when they design a device, they have to implement security by design, so that the legacy situation is not that bad. If the device gets into the end of support status, then at least a certain amount of security by design is already implemented. And that is, by the way, required by the current regulatory requirements, that you bring devices to the market that are secure by design according to the state of the art. The next topic is comprehensive documentation. So you have to provide security documentation, not only for auditors or authorities, so the internal documentation, but also the external documentation, the accompanying documentation to the product, which is handed over to the operators. So for example, software bill of material must be created and handed over to the operators. This is very important because the operators ask for that. They are responsible for risk management. They want to do risk management, but for that they need the SBOMs on their own. Not only the manufacturer must use the SBOMs to monitor vulnerabilities, also the operators. Early communication is very important for the medical device manufacturers, which means they have to communicate end of life and end of support dates, typically 2 years in advance. And maybe you remember even the requirement from the FDA guidance document. They require to put the expected end of support date for specific software components within the SBOM. So this is I would say, a subgranular information that has to be provided regarding the third-party components which are in the device. Proactive vulnerability management is necessary for the medical device manufacturer. They must have a vulnerability disclosure process and timely patching. Third-party component management, which means if you know that a third-party component will get into end of life or end of support, then you have to make a transition accordingly. So you have to provide a strategy for that. Support transfer is important, offer compensating controls, upgrade options, and structured support transfer to healthcare providers, and also public transparency. So you have to publish the status updates publicly to inform all stakeholders and enable informed decisions. And this can be done, for example, by information sharing and analysis organizations. Next slide, please. Now we hand over to the healthcare providers. They also have some duties or obligations. So for example, they have to actively communicate to the medical device manufacturer, for example, identifying information needs and maintain an ongoing dialogue with the manufacturers about the device security status. So they have to exchange their knowledge, their experience, and their means of security insurance. They have to implement risk management. As I said, they do risk management on their own. By the way, there's also a standard, an international standard for that describes the risk management for connected medical devices. And this is implemented by the hospitals or by the healthcare professionals. Strategic procurement means they have to ask for end of life and end of support of supports and must be aware of that when they purchase products. Nobody would purchase a product where the end of support date is close to the current purchasing date. Baseline security, so they have to implement security measures or security controls within their networks. So the infrastructure security based either on NIST framework or in Europe, more relevant, the ISO 27001. Legacy device assessment. So they have to evaluate risks of using devices after end of support and make decisions. So for example, if you have a programmer for implanted pacemakers and this programmer is not longer supported, does that mean that you cannot use it anymore and you have to replace all the pacemakers in the patients in the market? Or does it mean that you continuously use the programmer device even if you know that it is not secure anymore because the manufacturer stopped its support for that? Post end of support preparation, so be prepared for this situation, have compensating controls in place. Operational readiness means if you know there can be something that happens, like an incident, a security incident, especially with legacy devices, then you have to be prepared for that by a business continuity process or planning and accordingly incident response planning. And a very important topic, staff training. You have to train personnel on secure device operations and detection of security anomalies. So increase the awareness of the staff. Next slide, please. Yeah, and this is a picture that is shown in the IMDRF document for cybersecurity legacy devices, and it just summarizes what I said. So you see the phases on the bottom: development, support, limited support, and end of support, and the corresponding obligations of healthcare providers and manufacturers. And you see that there is something that is called a post-market expectation level of support, and it goes up for the operator and it goes down for the manufacturer. So it's a smooth transition of responsibility along that life cycle where the manufacturer gives up responsibility to the operator, and the purple boxes show which information should be exchanged between both sides. Yeah, and there's another document that I want to mention, but just to mention, which is the Health Sector Coordination Council white paper or guidance or whatever it is. It is basically describing the same like the IMDRF document regarding legacy devices, but it has a broader scope. It also mentions something about the hardware components or safety and effectiveness as a result of security issues, clinical aspects, privacy aspects, intellectual property aspects. So it's just giving a broader scope of legacy devices. Yeah.
Thanks, Christian. So to wrap up and hopefully leave some time here at the end for questions, talk about what does the future of legacy look like? And there are a couple of things to consider. Obviously, general advice to reduce your future legacy burden. As we discussed, follow secure design best practices for the manufacturer, plan for long product life, select appropriate third-party components, and then ensure that security is inherently designed in. For the provider, stipulate security requirements and vendor security practices during your procurement process and in your contracts. Network segmentation, zero trust, security monitoring, all the security best practices should be applied here. But there are also technology trends that will have an impact on legacy in the future. We certainly are experiencing a consumerization of healthcare and a shift in care delivery. We're not talking about concepts like hospital at home and remote care and remote monitoring, but we also now have consumer devices that actually can measure your blood pressure, your pulse, and basic clinical data. Technology also will have shorter obsolescence cycles, but the replacement cycles are becoming quicker and quicker. That is certainly true for anything involving AI, as that is evolving at a rapid pace, but there are also other concerns and considerations for AI-based devices with regards to legacy, and then, of course, post-quantum cryptography, which we will discuss momentarily. So what we can safely assume is that legacy challenges will accelerate, right? We said earlier that future devices will be more secure, resilient, and robust, but that will take time to bring them in the market and replace the older devices. So we need to assume that devices will become legacy sooner because of, again, more rapid technology development. But initially, we will see more legacy devices because the old devices out there will need to be replaced, and that will take 10, 15, 20 years. We also need to manage new types of legacy challenges. AI is a good example for that. And adversaries will use new technologies to their advantage and as their opportunity. And again, AI would be a good example here. Post-quantum cryptography, just diving in as an example here. I think everybody is aware of what's going on in that discussion. Today's cryptographic algorithms are based on the assumption that a traditional binary computer will take a long time to crack the algorithm, to crack the cryptography. With quantum computers, that is no longer the case. Because of the much higher compute power, we think that within 5 to 10 years, that quantum computers will be able to break today's algorithms within minutes and hours rather than decades, as we assume with today's computing systems. There is also, just to mention that, a concern about data harvesting, right? That encrypted data is currently being collected by nation states and cyber criminals because they know they will be able to break it in 5 or 10 years, right? So they're not attempting to break it now, but they know they will be able to do so in the future. Post-quantum cryptography is mainly a problem for asymmetric public key cryptography. Symmetric cryptography is inherently more secure. The algorithms are more difficult to break and will remain difficult to break, even for quantum computers. However, the reason we have actually asymmetric cryptography is that with symmetric cryptography, you have difficulties in securing and sharing the keys, right? Because everybody's using the same key, the two parties in the secure exchange. So you gain some and you lose some, obviously. The impact will be broad. It will impact web browsers. It will impact communication between systems. It will impact the way you remotely access your customers' devices and so forth. What are the current recommendations and guidelines? NIST here in the US has already identified what they call legacy algorithms that will be deprecated by 2030 and should be fully disallowed by 2035. Sorry, that is a typo here. It says 25, should be 35. And also by 2035, all federal systems must have completed their transition to post-quantum cryptography, and NIST has provided a number of algorithms that can be used to replace, again, today's legacy algorithms. In Europe, as far as I know, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, they have not made specific algorithm recommendations, but they have set forth also a 2030, 2035 timeline to complete the transition to quantum secure cryptography for high-risk critical infrastructure by 2030, which is darn close, and for a medium and low-risk system by 2035. So those timelines are not that far out anymore, unfortunately. So what can the manufacturer do to be ready? Well, can you design today's devices, the ones you have under development now, using post-quantum algorithms? If not, at least plan for cryptographic agility, meaning that your algorithms and the different types of keys you will be using can be upgraded in the future. There are certainly challenges, right? The hardware you're using today may not have the right hardware accelerators in it yet to support the new algorithms. So that is a problem to be sorted out. The new algorithms also may be weighing heavier on system resources, may require more memory, more CPU cycles. That's a challenge. And then certainly the upcoming cost challenge for field replacements and upgrades. It will affect data at rest, data in transit, things like remote access, digital signatures, software, firmware upgrades, your code signing, and so forth. So again, very broad and complex implications. And be prepared for regulatory enforcement coming at you within the next 10 years. As a hospital, as the operator of a device, you can identify devices that will be affected, have a good inventory, prioritize and make sure they identify the highest risk devices, include post-quantum readiness and upgradability in your procurement contracts. This will also impact your security tools and their capabilities, the stuff that runs on your networks that may, for example, inspect encrypted traffic that will need to be upgraded as well. Budget for system-wide upgrades of devices, systems, infrastructure, and so forth. And yeah, this may finally then kill many of the old legacy devices that are still hanging on today. That will push them finally over the edge. Couple of things on AI-based systems, right? It is just another security problem, but it is a much more complex security problem. So you need to, for example, protect your training data and your models. You need to maintain algorithm currency, make sure that your algorithm can be updated securely. And you need to maintain your overall AI platform and infrastructure, whether it is running on physical servers, on containers, in the cloud. Doesn't matter, it needs to be protected, and you need to be able to detect and log any changes and suspicious event. Any AI system will become a target, right? Intellectual property theft is a big concern for AI, but also model manipulation to basically manipulate a model so it provides incorrect or desired by the adversary results. But also AI then will be used by the bad guys for new forms of attacks. It will lower the bar for sophisticated and targeted attacks. It will be easier for even unskilled adversaries to create and execute narrowly targeted attacks. They will go mainstream. Finding new vulnerabilities and vulnerable systems will become much easier. And we will see that things like zero-day or end-day attacks will become available to the masses. So not only reserved to highly sophisticated nation-state attackers or cyber criminal organizations with significant financial means. So I think we're in for a fairly rough cybersecurity future here. With that, thank you. We will provide the handout with a couple of corrections I noted going through the slides. There is also here a list of resources that comes attached on the various topics we touched. So if you want to dive deeper. And we got a couple of minutes left for questions, so please put questions you may have in the Q&A chat.
Thanks, Axel. Thank you, Christian. So I do actually at our time, but you have the emails right here available. So if anyone has any residual questions, please take down the emails and email Axel or Christian what they have. And if there are ones, we'll take note of that as well. But once again, I'll thank our insight and our listeners for taking the time to attend the webinar. Thank you, everyone.
And thank you to HISAC for hosting. Appreciate that.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Yeah, it's our honor.